The Witcher, Hexer, Chapter 9. Trillzomn decides. Geralt had lit his blade with the lamp and lantern oil mixture, igniting the sword so that his steel was hot, to use a skill he taught himself that keeps the edges of his sword sharp while remaining in constant battle. Each time Geralt struck stone that was saturated with oil, he would swipe in such a way that it would keep his steel as good as the butcher's tools, if not better. Geralt of Rivia needed to fight much more than the emerging megalithic monster that was now before him. The monsters of the forest were drawing near to the fear and chaos that was naturally picked up by their senses for destruction. As monsters came rushing into the yard, the royal guards went into a defensive formation with their shields making a diamond shape in layers around and in front of the forest castle roadway to the main entrance. The knights were on horseback, while the guards were on foot. Guards were armed with newly forged spears with a spiked point, like a sharpened pole, and the other end was spaded with a double-edged diamond blade. The weight and construction of these new spears in these times surpassed any other previously used spear for their all-around use aerodynamically, down to the one-handed necessity, as well as the overall functionality for all types of combat. The shields were like single scales of a reptile. Each guard also had a short broadsword on both of their sides at their hips. Knights had weapons of their choice, which usually were many various assortments, in a type of large saddlebag on their preferred side behind their saddle, comfortably located on their beloved steeds. Most of the Forest Castle knights that night were armed with lances and did not even hold a shield, so they could have complete control as best as they could while staying strong, tight, and firm on their horses. Lances were the knight's best bet against the monsters that came for blood. Monsters could always be anticipated in times of battle, for their acute sensing of violence and bloodshed. There was a large number of schizoi monsters known to be roaming the forests during this time. The royal guards knew to be ready for them. Stories came back to the forest castle from the knights who were brave enough to venture out into the deeper parts of the forest canyon, where the valley branched out from the ancient ravines that used to be like separated rivers and smaller streams. Over time, these once abundantly flourishing bodies of water dried out during the conjunction lapse. Ones who encountered these types of beasts described them as having a large tail-like leg from the back end of the creature's abdomen, in which they could propel themselves about 30 yards with a strong lunging jump. These schizoi ran on hair-like legs which grew out of their torso. These legs were so many and so thin that they could never be counted, like the bristles of the old bottle brush flower. Schizoi monsters normally were the most common monsters known to avoid humans. If they sensed great fear or some kind of distractive disturbance, then and only then would they be seen. They only showed themselves before a kill. Otherwise, the schizoi remained in the shadows in the cover of darkness. Their eyes shone a bright red, and this phosphorescence also glowed under their bellies and between the thin gaps of their numerous legs. Large lines like a scorpion tail separated the joints of the creature's body. Different from a snake's body, yet they were almost as long in bodily proportion. The schizoi had no arm-like appendages, although they could wrap their many legs around their prey after jumping on them. Their large mouths were located at the top of the underbelly, bottom of their jaw stopping at the place where their stomachs would be. These jaws of the schizoi monsters could not be seen unless they were jumping at you or something next to you. This was the only vulnerable spot of the creature other than their legs. You could dismember their legs to make them less immobile, but they could move very quickly even still without them, altering their movement functionality into that of a serpent, while still being able to push themselves along quickly with boosts from their back-end appendages. Dislimbing the schizoi proved to be dangerous. If you removed their legs, the creature would have to adapt to not using them and flopped around at first, still trying to run and jump with its phantom limbs. This meant that the schizoi would be sloppily inaccurate with their movement, removing their sense of proper aim and reflex. So, if you removed the schizoid's legs, you had to be ready for the repercussions of a wild, flopping monster that was even more unpredictable and harder to kill. This made killing the creature's top priority by way of reaching their mouth. If a knight could get their lance inside of their mouth while on horseback, then the schizoi could be run through with ease. This was the goal for the Knights of the Forests. The royal guards were well trained with shield and spear. Acting together, the forest castle guards could be successful in this battle, since they were ready. The giant stone worm, however, once manifested, was knocked over by a strong charge by Geralt the Witcher. As Geralt saw this huge beast wobbling, moving itself towards him with a fast chattering mouth at the tip-top point where a head would be, there was no wasting time. Geralt of Rivia knocked the giant stoneworm down with a hit from his shoulder and elbow, stronger than an elk. The giant stoneworm rolled over 6 men in the front of the royal guard. Some of the best ground fighters of the whole bunch were taken out by this and instantly killed. The morale of the rest of them became sour and exceedingly bitter. The men groaned and sighed. None of their weapons could penetrate this thing that seemed like a living spike rock that could somehow shift its body into bendable movements and postures. The stoneworm had this chattering mouth like a small ring with bristly teeth, and were like the legs of the schizoi. These were the only commonalities between these diverse creatures. It may have been the defining characteristics that kept the alliance strong between these monsters, that being some sort of relative in the monster kingdom. The mouth of this giant parasite was small compared to the rest of this creature, which measured in at the size of 3 full-grown bears put together in comparison. With these living teeth acting like fingers, they forced flesh as they broke up pieces into its small mouth. The mouth was only as big around or slightly bigger than a man's head. This was the tip-top of the giant stoneworm, which was its head with no other distinguishable features. The end of this creature was shaped at a point like a spiked icicle, and the rest of the body of this thing was enormously round. being basically flat at the bottom like a table. This megalithic beast, whilst being knocked to the ground by Geralt, became more angry than when it appeared, and ate a knight's head off of his body while wiggling to get upright and vertical again to continue attacking Geralt the Brave Witcher. Geralt charged the beast with the tip of his sword, but could not get the blade of his sword into the rock-like skin of the giant stoneworm. Geralt of Rivia became tired, exhausting himself with repeated charges, and no matter how he hacked and stabbed, there was no penetrating wound to be made. Once the knights came to keep the incoming monsters from attacking Geralt, the Witcher noticed the way these valiant knights killed the schizoi. Geralt then jumped on top of this giant worm and put his glove into the mouth of this ungodly monster to keep it open while it screamed this horrible screeching noise that sounded like the rubbing together of stone and wood. With sword still in hand, while the other held the mouth of the beast open, Geralt of Rivia legendarily slain the last remnant of the dangerous underworld monster species. Geralt the Witcher clenched his own jaws down, grinding his teeth, while he pushed and shoved the entire blade of his sword down the throat of the giant stoneworm monster. The thing choked and coughed up blood that was darkest of red, almost black, like cancerous coagulated blood of the dying. In its final movements, the giant worm threw Geralt on his back while trying to roll over his body, slamming the Witcher to the burning ground. This attempt didn't work, as Geralt brought death to the evil creature. The knights and guards praised Geralt with all their might. In all his lifetimes, this praise for Geralt never usually happened. Never before did this happen, since mortal men usually despised Geralt for what he was, as the Hexer they knew him to be. The fighting men of the forest never before saw Geralt looking and acting so cheerful, so they fought the schizoid monsters valiantly, as good knights protecting their people in the land of the forest they knew to be their humble home. Side by side, the remaining men killed the schizoi until they retreated. Not another man died after Geralt killed the giant worm that night. The celebration was intensely great, lasting until the early morning sunrise. Geralt stumbled outside with his arm around the eldest knight of the forest castle, and it made the queen physically sick, after already making herself sick from her constant drinking. "What are you doing?" The queen stood at the edge of the forest castle yard, gagging while trying not to vomit. Geralt looked faint and answered with a grimace on his face from the sight of her. "I'm celebrating. What does it look like I'm doing, you old dog? We saved your kingdom tonight, this very night. This night and those nights, and myself, your guards." Geralt let out a flowing stream of puke, vomiting all over the ground, while the old knight laughed, trying to get away. Geralt was in that moment, before holding himself up, walking together with the eldest knight, who the queen favored, as Geralt and this man held each other up while they walked with their arms around each other's shoulders. "What do you mean tonight, you fool? You've all drank my wine until it has become morning." The queen of the forest made her cares known. "Don't worry, my dear. We didn't touch your wine. We drank everything else." The old knight laughed until he could barely breathe, as Geralt smiled with him, wiping the puke from his mouth. "Get away from me, you drunkards! The queen could no longer hold her vomit from coming out and spewed all over the ground, adding to the mess she looked down upon, which Gerald had just made. In the middle of the forest, before that very sunrise, Gerald's band of misfits were stopped by Trillzomn. Borch and the bard had wandered to where they wished not to be. Nothing could have prepared them for the descending creature as he let himself be known. In these moments, Gerald, the royal guards, and all the Forest Castle knights were too busy celebrating after the victory to have ever even had the chance to see the maiden arrive overhead with the infant Ciri. The queen was instructed to stay quiet until S would return to speak again with her. While the sun was still hiding just under the landscape of the mountains, Trillzomn stopped the four who were following Gerald but separated. At first, Gerald's band of misfits didn't realize why their horses stopped in the pitted area of that wilderness. The horses were not typically scared, especially since they had around their necks these special lanterns Borch made for them. These lanterns lit their way with a good amount of light and kept the precious steeds from becoming frightened. With great care in his handcraftsmanship, Borch made these necklace-type lanterns for the beloved horses. These lanterns actually were several tiny lanterns boxed together with ball bearings linked with a cord. Leather between the metal protected the horses from the heat, while also comforting them with the right amount of warmth, thus keeping the horses strong both mentally and physically. So Borch especially knew, as did his daughters, that something wasn't good in this particular pitted steepness of the dense forest valley. Within the canyon, the valley had different levels of the valley plain. Some areas were more dangerous than most, this being the pitted slope with the most dangerous of all areas within the territory unclaimed by man. This was the most perfectly ideal place for Trillzomn to reveal himself to the four misfits. Trillzomn floated down from hovering above the treetops and was seen in front of the bard first, as Hexer surprisingly felt the need to lead the way, since he knew where the path picked up from out of this uncharted part of the forest. Although the bard did not travel through this particular part, as no one did, Hexer traveled alongside the dangerous area from afar, many a times before, probably more times than any man, aside from Geralt of Rivia, since the bard was a traveling ladies' man. The horses did not budge, and stayed still, remaining quiet. Hexer gasped with a large breath as he first saw in front of him the descending being from the stars. Trillzomn introduced himself. I am Trillzomn. My race of beings live beyond the stars without a home. They are not communicative like me, and so I am alone, roaming the places in between worlds since the conjunction of the spheres. I've been waiting to show myself to people, to prove that I'm not necessarily harmful to you or your place. I have decided to make your place my home, if you will allow me, and then you can help me reveal myself to others, so that they may know me and not fear me. The simple speech Trillzomn gave was not as frightening as the bard or any of them had first imagined once being stopped in their tracks. If he wanted to, Trillzomn could have killed them all before any of them even knew what hit them. All of them knew it and sensed Trillzomn's power, just like the horses. There was a sense that a comet or a meteor had fallen from the sky, only it came in the form of a living celestial being. Trillzomn's celestial body perforated with large pores that emitted the spatial gas, which was calming for Borch, along with his daughters Tea and Vea, and even the horses. But Yesker was so excited that the gas had little effect on him. Trillzomn could not produce a stronger gas at a higher frequency without changing the potency and effects it would have on everyone. So Trillzomn came up with a clever thing to tell him to keep the four in check without a fight. Yesker the Bard had set up the deception for Trillzomn to build upon. Have you come to help us fight the monsters and evil sorcerers? These problems are getting to be too exhausting for me. The Bard naively and innocently asked, like a kind, communicative child asking his father. Yes, I've come to do just that, but not in the way you know fighting to be. I can fight without using the violence humans practice. I'm here to show you and to teach you. There is a better way. Trillzomn laid the foundations down in order to intercept their vulnerability. I always believed this. I always did. From the bottom of my heart. Oh, this does my heart good. Can you believe this, Borch? Tea, Vea, what do you think? Is this not the best news we could have ever asked for? Yesker looked at his group with confusion, as he wondered to himself as to why they seemed so calm. Their calmness was out of character, and so Trillzomn tried to distract the Bard. Please tell me, where can I go to meet more of your kind who share your same cause? Well, we cannot really tell you at this very moment, but if you help us find our way to the road, which I know we can't be too far, then we will be on our way to show you, as we fulfill our mission to help the good people afflicted. The Bard tried with his charm to be as likable as possible, not knowing that these things didn't matter even in the slightest consideration to Trillzomn, the secretly malevolent being. I will guide you out of here, if you only look above while I show you the way to this main road. You are correct. The path is not far from here. You've just strayed into the valley floor. Trillzomn kept up a good act. All right. Let's go, Borch. Tea, why aren't you hopping to it? Are you too tired from riding all night? Yesker pressed him to move. Oh, sorry, lad. Yes, that must be it. Borch shook off the hold caused by the gaseous emission from Trillzomn's evil cosmic powers. Trillzomn went from standing to floating upwards, as he brought up his legs into a crossed position, sitting in the air. He moved slowly so that the group would not lose sight of him as he flew above them. Trillzomn did not move until everyone was up on their steeds. He sat in the sky calmly, like he was sleeping, and remained in this motionless position while he flew for a little over 4 hours at the pace of the horses. Can you believe what we're seeing? The Bard turned around to look over at his shoulder, addressing Tea and Vea, who were not saying a word, as they were good at staying quiet. Bard, you should stay quiet and ride. Borch gave a seriously hard look that spoke warning with the eyes. Aye, Borch, I'll do my best. Yesker was too cheerful for Borch's liking normally, so in this time following Trillzomn after barely meeting, the cheerfulness was almost too much to handle. It's like asking my asshole not to shit all day. It's just going to get worse. Borch said with a glumness. His daughters bit their lips while they held back laughter as Borch's words did the trick, making Esker think twice before he continued running his mouth. Duny and Pavetta were on the path behind them, already on the road, but were stopped by Trillzomn before he reached Teovea, Borch, and Esker. With one simple warning, Trillzomn didn't have to say anything else to get Pavetta and Duny to turn around and never come back. Trillzomn showed his power, and nothing more could be done in the minds of Sorella's parents. Their hearts were broken on this night. Trillzomn told Ciri's parents as he came down hard on the ground like a rock from the sky, "If you continue, your daughters will die. If you ever come back to the forest castle, the same fate as this tree will be her fate." Sorella's parents watched Trillzomn ignite a tree with fire so powerfully the pine went up in ashes to the night breeze within a split second, seemingly with his mind. Trillzomn floated in this meditative legs-crossed sitting position while his pores emitted this invisible gas. The heat waves could be seen, making the surrounding trees appear as if they were moving like a mirage. If only Pavetta and Duny could have caught up to the bard before Trillzomn had got to them, then things might have been different, but this was not the destiny for Princess Sorella. Ciri had to be chastised in many trials to find her true destiny, and this is where the beginning of her trials started. Unfortunately for her parents, Pavetta and Duny, they would remain in a long-lasting tribulation with many hardships of terrible suffering before they would see their daughter again. Even when they would see her again, life would not be easy or last into old age as they would have liked to live. So Pavetta and Duny went back to the shores of the beach destination where they had originally planned on going to meet with their boat. Pavetta wept mostly the entire way there. After all the writing they did to try and catch up to their daughter, it meant nothing. Along the way, Duny would think about how he could kill this Trillzomn, but he kept hitting a wall in his mind. All he could think of was how his wife didn't even bother to use her powers against this floating man. Duny knew that in all her power, Pavetta couldn't see a way to stop this powerful being in her mind. They both knew damn well that Trillzomn was more than just a man, more than a hexer or a sorcerer. Duny couldn't think of a way to fight Trillzomn, and it quietly ate at him privately on the inside, while his wife Pavetta had let it go. The fight wasn't over, as they would encounter many other proverbial roadblocks on their way back to the ocean. Trillzomn had a secret. He was the one who called monsters to come from beyond the stars. Most of the monsters that afflicted the earth in those times that terrorized mankind were sent by the call of Trillzomn. Trillzomn had this way about him, with his extrasensory abilities, just like how he sensed S. In the same way, he called the Stalignos and came to Skiatekupata, joining powers. Trillzomn called forth long ago the monsters that came to Earth. He did not do this for any reason other than to get these creatures away from where he wanted to be at the time. He had no heart to kill them, but wanted to see them thrive as a dominating species. Once he had accidentally learned of the evil humans, then Trillzomn decided to come and kill mankind himself. With the help of Skiatekupata and the woman he adored, Queen Ciri, queen of the sea. Pavetta and Dooney's daughter Ciri would grow up to be a wise young woman before her time because of the life she lived for all her life. In Ciri's younger years, during her time spent at the forest castle, she had a feeling that there was much more to the story of her parents than what she learned from her granddaughter, the decrepit queen. Ciri would learn many truths the hard way, growing up without her parents, but the truth about them themselves was hardest to learn. This was not something that she could simply get over. Before she was grown, finding out what had happened, her grandmother had died, and her parents, Pavetta and Dooney, unbeknownst to them, were nearing the final years of their lives. After all the trials Dooney and Pavetta went through, they still were going to have to go through much more hardships during their travels. In Pavetta and Dooney's time spent away from their child for those early years, their lives would not be in vain. The banished royal couple would help people along the way, and it was a beautiful thing for them to discover together that even in tragedy they could make a positive impact in their world as they discovered other parts of the world unknown to their land, which was all they knew before. By their banishment, Dooney and Pavetta would start a new kingdom unlike anything else that had ever been on the earth. It lasted for 13 years. The events between this time are significant for the story of the Witcher Geralt of Rivia and for the world that has been long forgotten in time purposely, since the knowledge is dangerous. When Trillzomn forced Dooney and Pavetta to go on their originally planned travels during their extended honeymoon trip, he had no idea that another alliance would be happening after all the wickedness he set forth with the help of S and his desired queen of the sea. There weren't any other monsters who had the supreme intelligence comparable to the Malevolent Three. This is true, but what none of the evil ones saw coming was a beautiful thing. Dooney and Pavetta weren't completely helpless and alone. There were many other creatures of the sea that, although they weren't of the most supreme intellect as S, Trillzomn, or Queen Ciri, they were smarter than most humans. There were many more species in these days also that proved to be very useful to humans if they wished them to be. Not all of the creatures and monsters of the sea were malevolent people-eaters. Many more than you would think were lovely creatures who lived to help each other. And when word got out in their world that Dooney and Pavetta were being attacked by an alliance between their Queen Ciri, Trillzomn and S, many of the sea monsters and creatures were very unhappy. Trillzomn never could have seen this coming. Having made enemies with most of the creatures of the sea, this would create a war between monsters and creatures of the sea, as well as wars with those monsters and everything on land. Trillzomn had shaken the world with his coming to Earth. There were those sea people who weren't exactly people, but their own subspecies between what Queen Ciri was and the smaller monsters like her who were more primal. These were mostly ones she could intimidate and control. Then there were others who crossbred with the lovely creatures of the sea, who, although they had less human qualities compared to the ones who came directly from the species like the giant Queen Ciri, they were not solely destructive and had good hearts as their ancestors branched themselves away to breed apart from the senselessness of destruction. Queen Cyree was feared, and she tore down her own kingdom long ago. The creatures near her only obeyed when she made them, and it was done purely by fear, as everyone knew. So, these monsters and creatures were a broken kingdom divided in the sea, spread about all over the world's oceans. The ones who went in the opposite direction toward the other large continent were the ones who made it a point to separate themselves from the Queen of the Sea, Queen Cyree. The ones who could sing would sing in their hummed voices. Queen of the Sea, Queen Cyree, she beat us all down by the waves of the sea. Queen Cyree, Queen of the Sea, she changed the paths of our destiny. The horned-maned salmon monster who came to talk to S and Trillzomn in the riverbed was overheard by another creature who had a family that migrated away. The only reason this benevolent creature stayed here was to give its babies what they needed in their infancy, so they could have a chance to live and thrive compared to the many who would die, like the many others who had died while learning the hard way after the move to the different biological conditions. When this creature heard about what had happened to Dooney and Pavetta with their daughter, and the deceit being set up to destroy them, while knowing they would have to learn things the hard way like its own kind, this hit a soft spot in the benevolent creature's heart of hearts. With a fiery passion in its heart, this sea creature, similar to a platypus, only 3 times as large, went with all of its might to larger benevolent creatures who could travel faster and also send their voices faster for help, and to send word that there was a great deception coming for all the earth that threatened the lives of all monsters and creatures, both good and bad, considering the agenda of Trillzomn and the underworld king in his own right, the druid who called itself S. This webbed-foot duck-billed creature had teeth, and this was the only thing that set it apart from the platypus along with its intelligence. If it had to, it could eat people or other predators given its size and strength. It never did, though. This creature never harmed anything or anyone, and most of the creatures it knew had the same peaceful mentality that was sensible for their thriving civilization. On its way through the river that led to the ocean, through deep underground currents, through the caves above the underworld caverns, this creature traveled to spread the word to the like-minded, benevolent monsters and creatures of the sea who had left the direct control and domain of Queen Cyree. By the time she and Trillzomn would find out, the alliance would already have been made between Dooney, Pavetta, and the benevolent ones of the sea. That kind creature did like the horned-maned salmon commanded by Queen Cyree to talk to us and Trillzomn, but instead found Dooney and Pavetta on their way, just before trouble would find them. And that kind creature gave them just enough hope to get them through some terrible times along their way. Although the help of the sea creatures wouldn't be there to help them just yet, it was the most wonderful thought for Dooney and Pavetta to know that not only was help on its way, but a kingdom was going to be theirs to be shared with amazing creatures who were already thriving in their own creative technological advancements, far beyond what they had known to be possible, far exceeding the ways of the forest lands they knew.